Part 2 of the Yardbirds continues here on Pop Goes the 60s in 1966. So as they started to outgrow the blues, a more explosive and experimental direction overtook them. But before they could get to their experimenting, they had some issues with their manager, Giorgio Gomelski. So Gomelski and the band weren't on the same page at this point because Gomelski entered them in the San Remo Festival in Italy. He thought he could break the band in Italy. There were really no rock bands there doing much of anything, or even touring, and he thought that he could break them into that market. The problem was that the songs they had to do in this festival had to be recorded in Italian.
Lo so, non mi credi, perché sai.
Now, neither of these songs came close to qualifying, and despite all the nonstop touring, the band saw very little money. So they started to grow weary of Gomelski's management, and the last straw was this San Remo Festival, and then they fired him. Now, up to this point, the Yardbirds were relying on outside material for their singles, but they happened to be in Chess Studios in Chicago, and they came up with a gem of a song called Shapes of Things.
Shapes of things before my eyes, just teach me to despise.
Shapes of Things was inspired by Dave Brubeck's Pick Up Sticks, and it was a hit on both sides of the Atlantic. It hit number 3 in the UK and number 11 in the States. The lyric was rather socially relevant, and the guitar sounded very futuristic, so this is considered a proto-psychedelic gem. So with Gomelski fired, they needed to hire a new manager, so they got Simon Napier Bell. So the first thing he did was got them some great advance money for some future recordings, which was good, but one thing he did that was not so good was that he removed Gomelski from management, but he did not remove him from future royalties. So that's an issue that haunted the band for decades. Over, Under, Sideways, Down was the lead single for the next album. So the next album, I'm going to show you a couple different records here. So this was the UK version called Roger the Engineer. This is a reissue, so the real one looked like what I'm about to show you on screen here. This is a Canadian version. Now, I don't have the American version. Let me show you that as well. The Canadian version came out a little bit later, which is why we have Jimmy Page on this cover. But these are relatively similar tracks. The American and Canadian versions have the singles on them as per usual. And this album is actually notable because the band wrote the entire thing themselves. Now the problem is they recorded the entire thing in 5 days, and it sounds like it. They just didn't put the time in, and they were literally writing lyrics as the songs were being recorded. Let's look at this again. So this album goes by 2 different titles. It's either called The Yardbirds or Roger the Engineer, this is a Chris Dreja drawing. He did all the cartoons on here, and McCarty did the liner notes. So this is a really, from top to bottom, a self-produced album. This is the only album that ever charted for them in the UK. Now, the American comparable album called Over, Under, Sideways, Down charted at number 52. And that last song I played for you, Turn to Earth, was them getting more into that psychedelic territory. But the songs I didn't play for you are really throwaway quality, which is a shame because if this band was given 3-4 weeks in the studio, they could have come up with something really special. Now these guys were totally capable of doing something extremely special, and they showed that with something that Jeff Beck worked on next. Now, before Gomelski was fired, he was starting to position Keith Relf to do some solo singles. He was really grasping at straws. He also did the same for Jeff Beck. Now what Beck did is he put together an ad hoc band with him, Jimmy Page, John Entwistle, and Keith Moon were supposed to join. And Entwistle ended up opting out. This is a period when The Who was possibly going to break up. So Keith Moon showed up in disguise, and on bass they ended up getting session player John Paul Jones. And they topped it off with session keyboard player Nicky Hopkins, and they worked on a song called Beck's Bolero. This song wasn't released till the following year, and it was a B-side, and then it wasn't on an album till Jeff Beck's solo album in 1968. And even in 68 it sounded groundbreaking. So this was, when it was on that B-side, guitar players like Duane Allman and Joe Walsh were big fans of the Yardbirds, and this was a big inspiration to them, especially when learning to play slide guitar. At this point, Paul Samwell-Smith quit the band. He was tired of touring, and he wanted to get into production and produce full-time, and he quit one night after a drunken performance by Keith Relf when he fell into the drums. That was it for him. So Jeff Beck put it this way: "We were up shit creek without Paul. We needed that bass. So I thought, well, if Jimmy and I both play guitar, it would be quite amazing to have this sudden tandem thing going on." So Page joined the band, and at first he joined on bass so that Chris Dreja, the rhythm guitar player, could make the transition to bass. The first thing they worked on as a tandem dual lead guitar was the song Happenings 10 Years Time Ago.
10 years time ago, situations we really know.
So Happenings 10 Years Time Ago was a really cutting-edge guitar song, and though it was kind of a mid-hit on both sides of the Atlantic, it still sold fairly well. Now, late summer of that year, they scheduled a tour for the US with a new lineup, and problems started right off the bat. Jeff Beck got tonsillitis. The band itself, they were getting a little bit weary of the road. I mean, they had these horrible package tours where they'd be on this Dick Clark bus with 3 other bands, and sometimes they would do 2 shows in cities like 250 miles apart, 2 shows a day, and it was just really grueling, and they didn't get much sleep. So that was going on at this time. So when they went back to England, Jeff Beck rejoined the band, and they supported the Rolling Stones and Ike and Tina Turner. And they had some really fine shows. When these 2 guys were on, they were really on. And there was one show where they had several encores right before the Stones were going to go on. They kind of showed up the Stones. So their next venture was appearing in the film Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni. This is a great film. The backdrop is swinging London, and I think this is just a wonderful film. It's in the Hitchcockian mold, I guess you'd say. And this is, the soundtrack was mostly done, it's a jazz soundtrack by Herbie Hancock, but the Yardbirds, who appear in the film, do the song Stroll On. Unfortunately, this was the last of 3 songs recorded in the studio with the Beck-Page lineup. And it wasn't long after that Jeff Beck began to break down again. He was suffering from some nervous exhaustion. He was really edgy on the road. And with the tonsillitis, he never, I don't think, fully recovered from that. So when he was in California, he quit. He didn't actually quit the band. They actually fired him because he was slightly unreliable at this time. Jeff Beck stayed back in Hollywood with his Hollywood girlfriend, Mary Hughes. Now that name gets dropped in the song Psycho Daisies, and she was a Hollywood starlet, I guess you'd say. She was in some movies like Bikini Beach, which starred Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello. She was in Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine, Murderer's Row, How to Stuff a Wild Bikini, Pajama Party. Well, you get the idea, but if you have a look at her, it's hard to blame Jeff Beck for staying behind with her. Now down to a 4-piece band, the Yardbirds reverted back to trying another Graham Gouldman song. This time they did a song called You Stole My Love. This song never got off the ground. Number one, Paul Samwell-Smith was there to produce it, but he had already produced the same song for the Mockingbirds the year earlier, and that song failed. So he didn't really want to do the song again. And there was a disagreement between him and Jimmy Page. So with the low charting performance of Happenings 10 Years Time Ago, the firing of Jeff Beck, they just spent all the studio time on You Stole My Love and didn't even get a track out of it. So they ended up saying, well, we're going to change things up here. We're going to bring in a producer that can get some hits, and they brought in Mickey Most. Now, Mickey Most had hits with Herman's Hermits. He produced Donovan, and Donovan was a little bit more progressive, obviously, but the record label wanted to get a hit. Now the first single they worked on was Little Games, and this charted at number 51 in the States. It did get to number 13 in New Zealand, but did not chart at all in the UK. Now this song was pretty good, but Mickie Most, he was out of touch with FM-oriented rock, and he was probably the wrong producer for the Yardbirds. Now this first single rendered a B-side that was a group composition called Puzzles, which is probably one of the better songs they cut for Mickie Most. Now Jimmy Page started using the violin bow on stage and in the studio for effects. So there's 3 songs on here where you can hear the effects of the bow: Tinker Tailor Soldier Sailor, Glimpses, and 10 Little Indians.
Then there were 5.
Now, there are several throwaway songs on the next album, Little Games, but they do have a couple great acoustic pieces and some blues throwbacks as well.
Almost nothing to do, gone away. Now I'm far from you, though I'm
So the rest of the songs in this album are really half-baked and ill-conceived, just like the next single that they forced them to do called Ha Ha Said the Clown.
Ha ha, said the clown, as the king lost his crown, as the night...
This was supposed to originally be a Keith Relf solo song, so the backing track was already recorded and none of the Yardbirds actually play on it except for Relf sings on it. It did chart in the United States briefly, but this was not indicative of their sound at all. To support the Little Games album, they started another US tour. Now the band was starting to fade a little bit at this time and they were getting tired, except for Jimmy Page, who was just getting warmed up. So he was using the bow a lot more and soloing with this and starting to really take off. And he started using the bow the year earlier, and he knew through his session work David McCallum's father. Yes, David McCallum, the actor. His father was a violinist in the Philharmonic Orchestra, and that's how Page started bowing the guitar, because it was David McCallum Sr.'s idea. And McCallum also played on A Day in the Life by the Beatles as well, so he was a very well-renowned player at that time. Now, while sharing the bill in America with the Youngbloods and with a guy named Jake Holmes, the Yardbirds discovered a new song that Jake Holmes, a folk singer, had done called Dazed and Confused. Now, Jim McCarty and Jimmy Page both bought the album and they learned the song and they added it to their act. Dazed and Confused, under the title I'm Confused, became the Yardbirds' closing number, and they would bring the house down with that. And the story behind the appropriation of this song by Jimmy Page is rather interesting, but that's a topic for another video. So the next single they worked on was one called Goodnight Sweet Josephine, and this was extremely commercial, not as sickly commercial as Ha Ha Said the Clown, which by the way was well covered by Manfred Mann. The next song, Goodnight Sweet Josephine, incorporated some of Page's guitar work, but it was rather bubblegum for the Yardbirds to do. The B-side, however, was more the Yardbirds style.
Good night, sweet Josephine. Good night, sweet Josephine. Take a while, think about it.
Think About It was a group composition by McCarty, Relf, and Page. It was a great slice of late 60s grungy psychedelia. So by this time, this is early 1968, and Epic Records attempted to record a live concert to release as an album. The problem is they didn't tell the band, so the band wasn't really ready for this concert. And although they were received really well by the audience, they gave somewhat of a tired performance. Now that album was released and withdrawn. It was released in 1971 and withdrawn because Jimmy Page didn't want it out. It was released in a ridiculous cover. This is a CD version of it, but this is live at the Anderson Theater. And it does have a live version of Dazed and Confused and a very great rendition and different rendition of I'm a Man. So by this time they had hired a new manager, Peter Grant, and Grant was very good at getting them the money that they deserved. So they were making a little bit more money for these later shows thanks to Peter Grant's technique, shall we say. And they did go into the studio to record a follow-up album to Little Games, and that's called Cumular Limit. This was released in 2000, has some very interesting recordings on it, and gives you a great insight of what the Yardbirds could have continued as. They do have a version of Dazed and Confused on here. A couple good rock songs, one called Avron Knows, and an interesting flamenco-style acoustic guitar performance called Spanish Blood.
You act like a cat. Yeah.
Now, one song that wasn't included on here is a song called I Know I'm Losing You, and that is the original version of what became Tangerine that was released on Zeppelin 3. Now, that song, plus the aforementioned live album, there was issues with composer credits, so that's why these things didn't come out, and it's too bad because I Know I'm Losing You could have been released on this, but was not released. But here's what it sounds like.
How will you spend your time, my love? Crying to the clouds above, my love.
So Keith Relf and Jim McCarty formed together, which was a duo, and this was a little bit more acoustic psych. And these two guys were like two of the only people that couldn't see the direction that rock music was going, which was harder and not softer. So Jimmy Page and Chris Dreja wanted to continue, but Page continued, assembled Led Zeppelin, and the rest is history. So the band really fizzled out, unfortunately, and they did leave behind a lot of great music. I just want to show you a couple other things here. This is a picture disc I picked up. This is by Rhino. This came out in the early 80s. This was an interview disc. So the other thing I want to show you is this book by Greg Russo. So this is probably the most comprehensive history on the group, and it's called The Ultimate Rave-Up by Greg Russo. Another book you might be interested in is by a guy named Alan Clayson. It's just called The Yardbirds, the band that launched Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. So I'll put links to both of these books below. If you're looking to buy something and start off with the hits and some of the great bluesy stuff, there's a 2 CD set called Ultimate, which will really give you a good starting point if you're looking to get some new Yardbirds stuff. One other thing I brought out that I forgot to show earlier, this is one of the original handbills from the San Francisco show at the Fillmore. And this is from late 1966. And I don't have many of these type of things. I've got a few different handbills, but the posters are worth a lot more money. But this is an original, so it's one of the few original things I have of the Yardbirds outside of some albums. The Cumular Limit was just re-released called Yardbirds 68. It does have the song I Know I'm Losing You, but the vocal has been wiped clean, so it's just an instrumental. So the lyrics were an issue, and Keith Relf wrote the lyrics, by the way. One other one that I want to bring up, the Little Games Ultimate, this is Little Game Sessions and More. This is a double CD set, and this is still readily available if you're looking for some of those light period psychedelic tracks. There's some stuff by Together, that's the duo by Relf and McCarty on here, and some unreleased tracks that are okay. They're, I would say, are for completists only. Well, that does it for one of the most explosive bands of the 60s and one of my favorites. Hope you enjoyed it. Plenty more bands coming right here on Pop Goes the 60s.